Good morning, and welcome to this morning's webinar, where we will be launching a paper on online harms, citizens under surveillance. This has been written for the Institute by a good friend of the Institute, Bronwyn Williams. Those of you familiar with our work will recognize her, but for those who may not be, Bronwyn is a polymath who will challenge your assumptions about the present and the future. She's a futurist economist and business trends analyst with over a decade's worth of experience in strategic management, trend research, and strategic foresight, with a wealth of consulting experience for prominent companies and institutions. Dare I say it, some of her insights have the capacity to make me rather afraid. This brave new world we're heading into, but always a fascinating person to speak to. As our lives go online more and more, the issues that Bronwyn is going to discuss with us today, I think, will become more and more germane to all of us and cause us to rethink many of our assumptions. So, with that, I'd like to welcome Bronwyn, partner in Flux Trends, to take us through what she's written and why we should be worried about it. Bronwyn, over to you.
Well, worried is a big word. Maybe you just want to be concerned or at least take an interest in what's happening across the world at the moment. And essentially, this paper really looks at a spate of new legislation that's taking place all across the world, not just in South Africa, although like with many things, us here in South Africa tend to be early adopters, if not actual international influencers when it comes to the future. But we're looking at regulation that's taken place in the US, in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, across the EU, and in New Zealand, or that at least that's coming on board quite quickly. It's all to do with online harms and risk. And why this topic is so interesting, not just because these laws all seem to be very synchronized at the moment, but also because it really is a great example on how nuances in language, in other words, semantics, can be used to change the scope of the law and the influence and power that governments have over citizens' lives. But perhaps I can take a step back and start by speaking about why these laws have been imposed. Well, not just because governments want more control and more surveillance over populations. This is an ongoing thing that we've seen really ramped up since 9/11, and it's only really rolled out further since then. But this new spate of laws is specifically designed to combat online harms and risks. And quite often these laws have actually been pushed by citizens who are asking their governments to give them more protections. And one of the things that people are looking for protections from is for their children, the sorts of information that children are exposed to online, and perhaps the actual risk of predation that takes place when people who don't have the greatest interests of children at heart go after and prey on children online. And there's also, of course, sort of rolled up into that is the whole sort of satanic panic around social media, and should young people be exposed to information online that could corrupt their young minds or interfere with their mental health. So there's this whole push with parents and with lobbyists, and we can see this sort of highlighted more recently since I wrote this report with the big book that came out with Jonathan Haidt, who's been talking out against social media and how it should be highly regulated and we should protect our children. So the demand side of these laws is firstly around protecting children from harms, both real and imagined online, that is being demand driven by populations. And the other sort of risk, and populations, again, have turned to their governments to look for protections from, are protections around things like terrorism. Okay, this is a little bit more downstream, but most of us are old enough to remember all those massive terrorist attacks that took place in Europe, again, post 9/11. And this really does instill a sense of fear across populations. This idea that people are able to organize coups in Africa, that they're able to organize terrorist attacks in Europe by arranging and organizing online. And that, of course, means that these sorts of groups have organized and disseminated information on platforms. And there's been calls for platforms to better regulate the users that engage on them. But who are those users? Those users are, of course, people like me and you. And the only way to address both of those population concerns when it comes to online risks and harms is for greater surveillance and greater attacks against things like encryption, or the ability to protect messages between one party and another. Now, on the one hand, you might say, of course, we need to have more and greater surveillance to make sure that potential terrorists or potential pedophiles are not able to share and collect information that is harmful to society and or to children. At the same time, in order to surveil and to catch those sorts of messages in a digital dragnet, they're going to have to catch and review your and my messages too. They're going to look at messages between lovers, messages between parents and children, messages between companies, for example. And of course, we again, as I said, are leaders in this. Our RICA law came out, a couple of decades ago, and that essentially made encryption among all sorts of types of communication illegal. That should the government want to surveil or want to look at your information, your messages from person A to person B, the government has the legal right to do that, with, of course, some checks and balances baked into our constitution. But this is now rolling out those same principles to the internet. And what's different about the internet and the real world is that everything digital can be tracked and traced. There is a footprint and a record of it. There's no sort of shadows and corners to hide in. Instead, the sort of protections we've had is been through platforms. So whether that be a WhatsApp or whether that be an Apple ecosystem that actually denies government agents the ability to surveil into people's lives and into our personal bits of information. It also touches on all sorts of issues around things like copyright and NDAs, which is why we've seen some really interesting cases coming online at the moment, much as I predicted, as we're starting to see really big platforms take the threats and the responsibilities that are coming along with these laws very, very seriously. So Adobe was just in the news about a month ago, took a huge amount of criticism for saying that it is going to start surveilling all their users' messages and contents. It's going to violate, as I said, all sorts of copyrights and NDAs. But a lot of this can be seen as preempting the sort of legislation that is coming on board and putting responsibility on platforms to surveil and to protect their users from nefarious bits of content being passed around that could be used to perpetrate crimes against humanity or crimes against, as I said, again, quite often children come into these sorts of stories. But now, while all this sounds good, I mean, it's very hard to argue against laws designed to protect small children from being attacked or sort of predators that are chasing them online. It's also very hard to argue against laws that are designed to protect citizens from terrorism. But what is really interesting about these laws is the way they are being phrased and the sorts of semantics around them, and how we are starting to conflate harm, which used to be much more clearly defined in the eyes of the law. I mean, if I hurt you, if I break your arm, there's a clear case of harm. But when it comes to harm in the information sense, which is what we're talking about, this is sort of harm abstracted and kind of virtualized. And how do you define what is harmful when it comes ultimately down to words and pictures, the whole sort of sticks and stones metaphor? So a lot of these laws are broadening the definition of what harm is. Harm can be not just hate speech, for example. Harm can be any form of discrimination. Of course, how long is that string? Again, when it comes to threats against the state, how far do you go? And that's why the semantics and the words used with these pieces of legislation are so interesting to keep an eye on, because it's turning good principled laws, at least if you are someone that does think you need sort of more protection from words and pictures by your government for your children and for your country, it's turning them into what I term to be skeleton key laws, laws that can be applied against really any sort of enemy of the state or enemy of the platform who is enforcing these laws, because they are so broadly worded. So when harm becomes virtualized to deal with issues of mental corruption, or perhaps mental harm, or perhaps hurt feelings even, then of course those laws can be applied quite loosely to anyone that kind of gets caught in those dragnets. The other thing that I think is really important when it comes to these laws is that it effectively turns the principles of Western liberal justice on their heads. The Western liberal justice model that we have followed in our democratic societies, at least in principle, if not in practice, is this idea that citizens are innocent in the eyes of the law until they have been convicted or under investigation of having committed a crime. Again, what these laws do is they put all of us under surveillance as if we are all guilty until we are proven to be innocent, or as long as we're proven to be innocent. So it sort of opens up digital search warrants that police can come into your house anytime without a warrant. And in fact, the people that own your apartment building, in sort of metaphor, have the obligation to let the searchers into your building, even if there is no suspicion that you have committed a crime. So it kind of turns the ideas of who is innocent and who is guilty on its head, and it gets us used to being seen as being guilty in the eyes of the law, and to accept that we are effectively already losing some of our liberties, those values around privacy and personal autonomy and property rights, for example, in the pursuit of this ideal society where we try and remove harm. And of course, harm just becomes this ever-extending concept that, as you know, of course, there's always more harm that we can protect against. And it's very difficult to push back against these things when you're talking again a bit about things like children, or it gets about things like terrorism, which are very scary issues. You come across as sounding either insane, like a tinfoil hat wearing person, or as just very uncomfortable kind of person if you do try to push back against it. But coming back to this idea of how we are exploding the ideas of what harm is, what harm against society or against children or against country is, I think it's always interesting to look at the most extreme examples. And although we've detailed all the different laws and what they have in common and some of the small nuances between them in the report, I think Canada, as usual, another sort of country that tends to sort of push the limits of the future, their version of these online harms bills, I think really interesting to look at. Not only have they changed the definition of what harm is and changed the definition of what hate speech is under the eyes of the law to include all sorts of forms of discrimination, including sort of any other kind of discrimination, they've also taken it upon themselves to not just surveil the innocent in expectation that we might commit a crime or a hate crime or a discrimination crime in the future. They've also taken it upon themselves to broaden the weaponization of the law against people, not just people who have been deemed to have been found guilty of a hate speech or of a harm-based crime under the definitions of the already much broadened scope of the law there. They've taken it so far as to say that people who are suspected of perhaps in the future committing a harm-based or discrimination-based crime, in other words, a words and pictures crime. We're talking here already harm abstracted away from the physical. So we're not saying people who have committed an act of hate, who have committed an act of terrorism, an act of harm against children. These are people who are now being suspected of potentially talking about or potentially committing a harm-based version of those crimes can be put under their version of a protection order. In other words, this whole thing, if you can take out a protection order, say against your ex-husband, if you've been a battered wife, and they'd be put into not being able to come close to you in your area, they might be asked to wear an ankle monitor, and under the suspicion that they're going to commit an actual crime. Now you can be put under protection order under suspicion that you might commit a verbal or video or words and pictures based harm crime that might also in the future lead to an actual harm event. So we've now abstracted the law twice, right? And broadened the definitions that go along with these things too, if that makes sense. The detail is again in the report if I'm losing you there. But this idea of crimes being abstracted and punishment being implemented in anticipation of a crime takes us really into the future where pre-crime is becoming a reality and a punishable offense. And according to the Canadian bill there, if you're suspected of being someone who might in the future say something naughty, never mind do something naughty, they can put you under house arrest, they can make you wear an ankle monitor, they can convict you and punish you as being guilty before you've even committed a non-crime, which is quite incredible. And this is the place that we are right now as a society. We are demanding more and more protections from potential harm from our governments, but we perhaps not considering fully the full extent of our liberties and also our ideals and values that are really under interrogation here. Those boundaries are being pushed. So anyway, that's sort of my take on it and why I thought it was an interesting issue to write about, particularly since South Africa is such a leader in this space. And it's something we should be paying attention to as global citizens too, because so many of these laws apply to international platforms. They are laws that will affect us, even if our own governments don't adopt the same laws. The platforms that we use, whether we're using them for work, whether it's a Microsoft or a Zoom account, or whether we're using them for our personal interactions, our social media accounts, our lives are going to be implemented or affected by them. We are going to expect more data surveillance. And perhaps there's one last point I can make here, in that these laws are also synchronizing now with what's happening with AI and a lot of the scraping those very same platforms are using to gather our data for either training their own models or again for sharing with international security agencies. And I find it's very interesting to find how governments' incentives and corporates' incentives to greater surveil communications and to greater attack encryption in communications are kind of synchronizing at the moment. So although this paper is not about the corporate incentives, I think it's really interesting that they are doubly incentivized to water down our ability to communicate privately going forward.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Forewarned is hopefully forearmed, and I do see this as a forewarning. Let me just start by saying, as I regrettably am able to say more and more now, I'm old enough to remember, where communications were paper-based. You wrote letters or you made a phone call. I remember in 1980, my father booking a phone call to speak to his family in Britain. This was something you did a couple of days in advance, and you had this window where you could make your call to be sure of getting through. Probably seems completely bizarre in an age where you can program someone's number into WhatsApp and you A for away. American privacy protections, I know, specifically refer to the post office and tampering with mail, because that was the way that you communicated with. And also having grown up in the 1980s, I remember that if you wanted sort of naughty material, generally you had to get a bootleg videotape or a very much thumbed through copy of the Lad Mag, which they always said if you want to import something illegally into South Africa, just make sure that you put a copy of Playboy at the top of your luggage, because that's all they'll look at. The other stuff will just be waved through. But the point is, we seem to be in a very, very different world now, and this is something, whereas a mass-produced newspaper has a certain precedent in cuneiform tablets, the digital world seems to be something entirely different, just a world that we've never seen before. And I'd just like to refer to something that you wrote in your paper. In a literal sense, more and more of our experience is being digitized. This is continuously increasingly made discrete. What is digitized and discrete can be codified, flattened, and managed into computer says no-go, algorithmically imposed laws which allow us to govern the ungovernable through increasingly sophisticated automated bureaucracies. And second, in a more figurative sense, we have become virtualized in the sense of becoming untethered from reality as we deny objective truth in favor of unfalsifiable subjective lived experience. Would you like to expand on that? Is this the brave new world that we were warned about?
Well, I think to a certain extent, I think it's really interesting that like you picked out that quote because it goes in both directions. It talks on the one hand of how we're making the unconcrete very concrete by trying to replicate more and more of our real life in the digital world, because that's kind of like the quite well-known book, Seeing Like a State. If we are able to digitize something, we are able to comprehend it, we're able to compute it, we're able to manage it perfectly. So if that information has been digitized into bits and bytes, we can put it into a nice little neat computer model that ignores the nuances and complexities and gray areas of the real world. We're able to try and control it. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to have greater control of our societies, trying to reduce ambiguity, trying to reduce risk, which is, I think, a natural thing to want. So I have understanding and empathy for societies that want to be better managed, that want to manage or have less risk, that want to have more control over their systems, whether they be economic systems or social systems. Because risk is uncomfortable and certainty is good for markets, right? And it's good for making decisions and it's good for feeling safe. But at the same time, we're trying to make that which is impossible to control controllable. We're also in a cultural moment where we are trying to deny a lot of objects of reality and replace it, as the quotation said, with more personal facts if you are from the right wing, or lived experiences if you're from the left wing, which all kind of leads to the same point of saying that my version of the truth is different to your version of the truth, but they both true, which is an incredible idea, but it becomes very dangerous when it can be weaponized in the eye of the law. So the bills that I've spoken about here, as I said, could be viewed as skeleton key laws, because a law that says thou shalt not kill, it's quite obvious if there's a dead body in front of you, a harm was committed, someone must be punished for it, there is a clear victim. But when you start to conflate harm with mental harm, with hurt feelings, with the perception of being discriminated against, they become unfalsifiable points, because there's no way for you to prove that my feelings weren't hurt, that my mental health wasn't damaged by your words, right? Because it's my word, it's my lived experience. And when we start to try and harden these very soft things into the codes of the law, we open up a large space for these laws to be manipulated by unscrupulous actors. And I use the word actors very deliberately. That's people who can claim harm, can claim discrimination, can claim all sorts of things based on lived experience that is unable to be refuted in the eyes of the law, creating whole new classes of victims and whole new classes of perpetrators, some of which these virtual crimes or virtualized crimes or personalized crimes, if you want to put it that way, are getting very real consequences, like those protection orders in Canada, which is really quite incredible. I could go to authorities in Canada and say that, Terrence is a threat to my future harm because I believe he could say something that is going to be discriminatory against me as a woman based on the sorts of tweets he's been liking, based on the sort of Facebook groups he's been hanging out on. He could come out and say something or tweet something or X something, whatever the platform of the day is, that will violate my rights and make me feel discriminated against as a woman. And real action could be taken against that. Yes, that's an extreme example. And the examples used by the law, which I should be careful to point out so as not to be too hyperbolic, have been designed around terrorism, which is why these laws get passed. They don't get passed thinking about the extreme ways they could be manipulated if I'm a disingenuous person. They're rather put into place to say, yes, if people are hanging around groups that are extremist groups, they could become radicalized. They could then start to actually say things that are mobilizing groups either against the government or to some sort of terrorist plot, or maybe to commit a school shooting, which is a real threat in those sorts of parts of the world, and saying that these people should be sanctioned and monitored and effectively sort of convicted of pre-crime without going through the long process of the law in order to protect and save lives. Quite often those ideas of protecting children and protecting communities overlap when you start to think about sort of, against school shootings and those sorts of crimes. How can you justify pushing back against that without being seen as someone who is giving space to plots or to mobilizing or to radicalizing young men and women in ways that society clearly doesn't want. But I raise these points just to say how the scope of the law applied can be applied in very different ways. And there's some interesting examples going on, I think, in the US at the moment, where with many of you will be familiar with, of course, the sort of insurrection or terrorist plot that took place after Trump's election, when he lost the election, and a whole lot of right-wingers sort of stormed the Capitol in the US. They're now currently being prosecuted in the US, which I'm sure many people would agree is the right thing to do. But what's interesting is the law that they're being prosecuted against under was designed to protect societies against the likes of Enron's, against white-collar financial crime. So the actual technicality of the law that some of them are getting sentenced under is a law applied in a very different space. It was never imagined when the legislators sat down and wrote the law. This was a law around manipulating evidence or getting rid of evidence in order to avoid conviction. So it was designed for the sort of Enron executives, or sort of as per the memes and movies, sort of burning papers or shredding evidence of financial manipulation, is now being applied against people who might have attended a protest or attended an insurrection and then deleted video footage of it, for example. They can be tried under that same law. So I just think it's really interesting to see how the scope of the law can be broadened and weaponized when it's not worded correctly, when the intent is then uncoupled from the way that human beings, being very incentive motivated beings that we are, start to apply these things in their personal lives, if that makes sense.
Sure. We're starting to get some questions, but I'd just like to follow up on something. You mentioned the Canadian example. Now, for personal reasons, I have some experience of that, and I remember I was very interested in it about 15 years ago. The case of prominent publisher Ezra Levant, who was taken before the Canadian Human Rights Commission. It's actually quite a sort of magnificent moment where when he was being questioned, he insisted on bringing a camera in so he could live stream the whole thing and sort of show that there was something strange going on here. What emerged from that was that this body that was given a very extraordinarily wide-ranging remit to protect human rights, effectively seemed to be coming across as a body that was pushing to remake the nature of society. And at one stage, they objected to a proposed legislative change on the grounds that would lead to an upsurge in Canadians calling for the genocide of their neighbors, to which someone cheekily responded, "Can you point to one instance where a Canadian has called for the genocide of his or her neighbors?" This is Canada, where people say thank you to their ATMs. And apparently a charge was laid against the Canadian Nazi Party, which was dropped on the technicality that the Canadian Nazi Party did not exist. But this was a sort of crazy, crazy barreling forward to try and root out evil that didn't really exist. In fact, Jordan Peterson, who's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think made a very, very prescient remark when Prime Minister Trudeau said something about Nazism. He said that in Canada, it would be surprising if anybody, if you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who's ever met a Nazi, because there is no tradition of that in Canada. This is something you need to go to, Northern Europe to sort of find, and still you're dealing with degrees of separation. But yeah, behind these tools, there are people whose motivations may not be, maybe more expansive. Now, is this something we should be worrying about?
Yeah, you should always be worried about laws that are written to be broad or to defend things that are effectively indefensible. So again, I can refer to our own constitution too, which was obviously written from a well-intended point of view, but it also contains things like the government's mandate to protect people's dignity, what is dignity, right? How do you define that within the confines of the law, which is a very blunt instrument? So how do you flatten, again, very nuanced issues and very personal issues and very shaded issues, and then sort of try and lock it behind a law? Of course, then that blunt instrument can be used as a weapon, right? So we must be very careful about legislating soft terms and trying to give them hard punishments, right? Because you can catch a whole lot in that dragnet. I think dragnet's quite a good word to use with a lot of this stuff here. We're all being caught up in this digital surveillance dragnet. All of our communication, things we might not want to be made public, but are not criminal. We've got sort of secrets and things that should not be part of the public domain. We're being asked now to submit all of our communications to the public domain for the greater good of society. And the question is that the sort of society that we want to have? And it's a society that I think that we sort of sleepwalking into. It's something that our children won't remember, a world without having every piece of information scrutinized. And I come back to Jonathan Haidt's novel around, or not novel, his book or his story, although there are some parts that I would claim to be more fiction than fact, in that the whole sort of satanic panic around, again, social media and trying to protect young minds from being, again, harmed through the sort of information they're exposed to online. A lot of that could be said that's coming from us too, right? The sort of society that they are a part of. And perhaps a lot of the mental harm coming from social media is the fact that we are kind of losing our right to privacy and our right to be forgotten, and that these young people are going to grow up essentially always on stage without a backstage to retreat to, which is a huge amount of pressure, particularly I think for young people who are trying to find their way into the world. All of us try out different ideas. Are we trying to figure out our own politics and our own philosophy? And do we really want to be tied back to the ideas we had when we were 16 years old? This is the reality of future generations. You will be tied back to that. And I suppose what these bills haven't yet tested is what happens when those definitions of harm and discrimination expand even more, as they're likely to do. What happens then with our past comments? So if you said something that was acceptable under today's definition of harm or discrimination, and that definition changes, as it does 5 or 10 years into the future, what does that mean for your future prospects, right? And like this ability to be able to not have everything that you say or do to everyone always scrutinized and tied towards your potential threats towards society is perhaps something we're going to miss. It's certainly going to lead to a whole lot of self-censorship and, as they call it, sort of social cooling or watering down of communication, because it is really scary when there are real hard consequences for soft comments, for words and pictures, not for actions that have hard results in the real world, because we're able to make that string ever longer, and we're able to sort of track and trace and breadcrumb sort of all these things, not just back into the past, but also increasingly into the future, where we start to infer what could come next. And we start to judge and perhaps punish people for the next step in the projected chain. Again, coming back to a lot of the things that we're trying to do with AI at the moment, which is basically trying to create prediction machines to generate the next image or the next sentence or the next word. We're trying to do that for human beings too, which kind of pigeonholes people, again, probably perhaps particularly young people, into a particular path, because if the machine or if the algorithm or if the law has already decided that you're likely to commit a future hate crime or a future discrimination crime or a future harm-based crime, you're already treated then as a future perpetrator. Your future path does become that much more narrow. Again, many of you, some of you listening to this might think those are risks worth having. In fact, that is a goal of some of these laws, in that it does force people into that narrower path and might therefore reduce risk to the greater society as we start sort of essentially turning the screws on people to prevent crimes. Maybe crime prevention is going to become a societal norm in the future, whereas at the moment it's something we want, but it's certainly not something that we expect to be guaranteed by our governments. But that seems to be the direction that citizens are pushing governments towards. So there's both demand and supply side reasons for the narrowing of the scope of that so-called sort of Overton window, but also the broadening of the sorts of things that get caught in that dragnet. So I think that suits the aims of a government that wants a simpler society, that flattens society to manage, and the aims of a population that wants, if not actually reduced risk, at least the illusion of having less risk in their lives, right?
Right. Look, I'd just like to say there's two words that I can raise which have, I think, taken on, certainly amongst the chattering classes, fundamentally different definitions from what I could remember in the mid 1990s, and I use that because that was the period of the transition. The one is racism. How that is understood, and the bars you would need to kind of get over to be reasonably regarded as a racist. And the second is the term woman. Once again, I think we've imported cultural war concepts from abroad, but this is something that you see on YouTube, particularly with if I can put it this way, right-wing influencers going around saying, "What is a woman?" And something that would be completely uncontroversial back when I was a student, or when our Constitution was written. Now as people doing cartwheels, and there appear to be some very real world consequences for saying now what was, in a sense, common sense back then. Let's move on to a question here. South Africa's security apparatchiks, I think that's probably a very pointed term phrase, are a rogue element. Should we be worried? I think, is this something that could be weaponized?
Well, the sort of laws that we have coming on board could be weaponized. They do leave scope for these sorts of the large dragnets on the one hand, and also the shall we say the generous interpretation of some of these laws. But I think we should also be encouraged, I think we mentioned it in the paper too, among some of the recent court cases that have drawn back, that have sort of squared the circle between our Constitution, as vague as it can be on some sides, that also works in our favor. So if you can have vagaries on both sides fighting each other, we've got sort of places to play out lawfare to defend some of the principles of our Constitution, of our society, against generously interpreted laws. But it's something we constantly have to be vigilant of. This is where both the media and the law step in to interpret the legislation that is put out there, whether it is designed with ingenuous or more disingenuous reasons behind it. But there's certainly enough risk of these laws being used against citizens that they weren't at least nominally designed to prosecute or to surveil. So we've got to look at it in both sides as to who the government is allowed to surveil, and also then who could be prosecuted under the eyes of the law. The laws that we have are broadly justified enough that they do need to be challenged in court. And the challenges in court could go either way, right? They could either force the laws to be more tightly written, so they become a more actual, a more clear-cut piece of legislation that can't be used by anyone towards anyone who's deemed to be sort of politically dangerous or politically inconvenient at that point in time. But at the same time, the law could also go in the other direction. The law does not necessarily equate to the wishes of civil society or to the wishes of the government itself. And if the law decides to interpret the laws that we have more generously, we could have a large amount of perhaps overreach into our civic rights and our civic space. So I think, again, the vagaries of our Constitution are both an asset and a liability when it comes to fighting back against these sorts of skeleton key laws and who they are applied against.
I think that you made an excellent point earlier, which speaks directly to this, and this is the exposure of information that points to behavior that is not illegal, but somehow frowned upon. So your porn downloads, for instance, you may be paying the subscription, whatever, but you don't really want your wife and your kids to know about that, or that we accept the state can go after you for bank robbery, but not for attempted adultery. But you're flirting with someone on WhatsApp can come out, or that you can when you add AI into the mix, you don't even have to do that. You can have a full video of you in, delicta flagrante with your with your secretary, and no one can tell the difference. And by the time you've actually had that pulled apart, that the damage is effectively done. In fact, I understand the first kind of real rollout of deepfakes was putting celebrity images into porn videos. And I think Scarlett Johansson was actually asked about that, and she just said, there's nothing you can really do about it. You can get restraining orders on particular images, but once they're once they're out there, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of sites that are probably carrying them, and people have downloaded them. It's whack-a-mole. You get it taken off one site, it's still on 50 others, and someone's uploaded it the next day anyway. The only defense you maybe have there is that you can say is that people might be aware, well, that's Scarlett Johansson, she doesn't do this kind of stuff. But whether it's someone cheating with a work colleague, that becomes more difficult. And also, as we were saying before the show, the poisoning of the information environment, where the fact that the stuff exists means that you can call into question almost anything. This is this a fake? I think I've been in one court case where the judge, there was a video of the alleged crime happening, and which I think spoke very strongly for the accused's innocence or at least justification. And the magistrate who in the bail hearing said, well, this could be artificially inserted, so I'm going to deny the guy bail. I think this had a lot to do with the fact that the magistrate just didn't want to give the guy bail, so he latched onto that, and the chap spent 3-4 months in prison before it was reviewed, and it meant ultimately the case was dropped. Another question here: what protections do individuals need to protect against in being condemned, convicted on the basis of what's happening in someone bureaucrat's imagination or paranoia? I think that comes out better when we try to reformulate it. But what sort of protections would we need to stop this overreach from happening? What's your sense of that?
Well, I think that there's two things. The first one is to be engaged with these bills before they get signed into law, when they start sort of white paper phase. And increasingly, these sorts of things tend to be sort of snuck through. People if you're not paying attention, you don't know that these bills are being written. They are being put out there. But you have to engage with it. Otherwise, you don't get to say. Like democracy is supposed to be a verb, not just sort of showing up to put your X on a paper. For a lot of this is kind of too late there. So the other question to be is if you do find yourself on the receiving end of these sorts of increasingly vague laws, you need to fight back and get good lawyers and test it in court, and hopefully get some of those sort of the sort of leaks made a bit more watertight with this. But I think that to a large extent, this should be a huge lesson to us. If the sorts of powers that are already written, already being passed, have slipped by without our noticing, what else is going on that we're not paying attention to? And are we being vigilant enough about the sorts of laws that are being written? Are we interrogating enough what's been putting out there? Like IntelliWatch is one such organization here in South Africa. Support those sorts of organizations who are doing the work of actually reading the laws that we just sort of hear about or find out about once you're actually convicted of one of these things. Some of the other things to start testing come back to what Terence is saying around AI, in that a new class of crime could very well become quite prevalent where these laws exist. If you don't like someone, again, if I've got a vendetta against Terence, I could create a deep fake that implies that he is engaging in hate or discrimination claims or crimes, and it'd be very, very hard for him to prove that he's actually innocent of that as these things become sort of more prevalent and more easy for people to use. And the sort of AI question layered into this sort of really undermines the legitimacy of a lot of these laws, in that AI generated content, since this is really content-based policing. Again, these are laws about words and pictures, not about deeds that take place in the real world. When those words and pictures can be manipulated both ways, when things that are true can be misconstrued as being fake, like the example Terence gave, or whether falsities and inaccurate statements can be put into my mouth or into my body and into my face, it really does undermine the legitimacy of these laws if we're not able to separate what is true and what is false. And we could talk about things like deep fake porn, but I think imagine how much more damaging to your reputation, to your future it would be if someone deep fakes a racist or discriminatory comment into your timeline, and how that would ruin your life and maybe even give you criminal charges based on the sorts of laws that we have. And it'd be very, very difficult for you to disentangle yourself. It becomes sort of trial by personal facts rather than trial by actual fact. And I think that's another one of the sort of dangers we need to look at here. So not super helpful in terms of what to do about it, but pay attention to the bodies who are scrutinizing laws before they become laws, and support the kind of lobbyists and groups who are taking some of these bills to courts to test their legitimacy and to tighten up the screws to make them less multi-purpose Swiss knife kind of tools, and much more simple tools that are not as easily weaponized by anyone who wants to weaponize them.
I would concur fully, and I would take a step back. That I think that we have to sort of go to we have to be radical in the sense of going to the root of things, which I think means to start with principles with interrogating principles of communication when these things are being debated, not to be sidetracked. You mentioned the word children, for instance. Now, this is nothing is more evocative, and that's why another issue that I have an interest in is firearm regulation for various reasons. It doesn't mean I'm a gun nut or a gun prohibitionist, but I do find the legislation around it worldwide to be very interesting. And I know that in the United States, particularly, this is often phrased in terms of children being killed. And though that discourse is bolted onto all sorts of things, some of which I think is very necessary, like securing guns when they're not being used. But that the idea that 1,000 children were killed in America last year, that sounds dreadful, and for that reason we need laws on trigger guards, for instance. But then you start to break that down. Well, are you talking innocent little toddler with shiny cheeks who found dad's gun and killed his friend, or are you talking about people below the age of 18? Because when you start to look at it from the latter, you find that sort of 2/3 of those children are 16 and 17-year-old people involved in gangs, and there's drugs and whatever, which first of all raises questions about how effective in bringing down those, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, you are being encouraged to think in a particular way, and with a particular train of thought. And I think that when this sort of legislation is introduced, it will often be justified in terms of, as you say, harm, because no one likes harm, but then also hate. And be careful about what hate can start to mean. Certainly, we at the IRR, and I would put in a word for supporting us amongst those people listening, which can be very easily done with a small debit order. But we have a long history of being very skeptical and opposing some of the hate speech legislation. And invariably, we find that our position is usually placed in contradistinction to those opposing hate. On the other side, you find the dreadful Institute of Race Relations.
Or life or hate.
Well,
that's very unfair. Very unfair, but yes, point made.
But yes, be careful what you're willing to give up in order to get rid of hate. Those who have read A Man for All Seasons will remember the dialogue between Thomas More and Roper. Would you cut down the law to get at the devil? For that reason, I'd cut down every law in England. And when all the laws were flat and the devil turned on you, what law would you hide behind then? And I think that is very much what we are facing. I don't know if there are any more questions. Otherwise, I can certainly fill in a gap here. What about the conjunction between business and government on this? In your paper, you mention requirements that tech platforms, and I think essentially that means tech entrepreneurs are going to be required to do the snooping. What does that mean? It's bad enough when you have government knowing your stuff, but
So you're kind of deputizing these sort of shop stewards to use South African language, or like,
right.
the Stasi, like your platform becomes the surveillance arm of government too. But again, I think South Africa is well ahead of that. Like our RICA law was designed not for the internet age, it was designed more for the telecoms age. And our cellular companies are very much the arm of government there in terms of, collecting your identity before you get a SIM card and all the rest of it. It didn't go anywhere near as far, but that was because, like telecoms-based communication was still voice-based, it was used different technology, whereas now we're talking about absolutely everything you put onto the internet. And so much of the things that we put onto the internet are through platforms. The social media platforms, the ones we tend to think about, but also think about the likes of Google, the likes of Microsoft, these very big platforms that we use for our business communications too. And this idea that governments cannot do this alone. They can only do this with the complicity of the tech platforms and of the operating systems too, is really interesting. So of course, Apple's a great case study to dive into there. They were, of course, the platform that was always like the most strict on encryption. They sort of sold themselves to people as being like, we'll protect your rights. But not so long ago, they were proposing actually scanning or pre-hashing all of the images on your phones to perhaps pick up anything, again, relating to child pornography. But in order to catch child pornography and those sort of pre-hashes as the communications go from one device to another or into the cloud, they also had to look at absolutely everything he did. And they said they weren't going to look at it. They were just going to look at the hash and only then look at it and all the rest of it. But the point is that everything was going to get scooped up in this dragnet. There was pushback and Apple rolled that back. But now with what's happening with AI, with what's happening with these sorts of laws, the likes of Apple are going to have to break their own encryption promises to users. And a lot of people have been freaked out about the sort of the surveillance of their personal information and data for being scraped to train AI models. But people are not seemingly as freaked out about platforms being asked to scan all of the same information using very similar technology in order to report to authorities any suspicious behavior, any suspicious pictures, any suspicious words. But it is important to note that that's why your terms and conditions are going to be updated. I mentioned the Adobe case. People are wondering why Adobe wants to scan absolutely everything. There's a cynical commercial reason. Let's scoop that up and throw that into our AI training model, these insatiable beasts that require more and more information. But at the same time, Adobe has read the bills that we've referred to in this paper, and they have seen that they can be criminally convicted and prosecuted under the same laws for failing to report people who are engaged in pre-hate crime behavior, which does require them, because they are storing this information on their clouds, that everything is a service economy, really has mandated that our information doesn't belong to us alone. There's also another custodian that could get into trouble if there's anything pre-suspicious on there, never mind suspicious. So increasingly, we are going to see these terms and conditions updated. And don't be distracted by the moral panic around AI. Think also about the timing. Remember, all of these laws that we refer to have been instituted within like really, I think it's like a 24-month period. It's a very quick rollout. They all go into effect also within sort of a 24-month period. And big platforms are going to have to adjust those terms and conditions in order to comply. Of course, it's very convenient that adjusting those terms and conditions also serves their own ends when it comes to collecting and scraping data for AI training purposes. So I come back to the point that the incentives around both platforms on the commercial side and governments are aligning very nicely at the moment to perhaps encourage us to accept the terms and conditions and the laws at the same time.
Okay, I think, look, we're coming to the end, but I'd like to sort of finish by asking for your reaction on this. You mentioned Jonathan Haidt, and I'm a Jonathan Haidt fan. I think he's one of the very few. I see we've got another question here, so let's take that first. Business is targeted by large organized crime groups, but government do not have the capacity to address this. Criminals obtain business and private information online and use that for fraud and more. We have some good laws, but government cannot manage. What do we do to educate and train people? Imagine the reference here is to managing their own data to make themselves less susceptible to bad actors.
Yeah, I think that probably ties closer into the point you were going to make about Jonathan and all the rest of it. But maybe we should start by educating our governments, because I don't think our government's officials and our MPs know much about what's going on in terms of the technicalities, in terms of the actual risks. They're much more interested in the sort of the juicy skeleton keys they get to play with that actually take these bills offline and into the real world and all into the faces of their political opponents or inconvenient citizens. They're very well aware of that, but perhaps they don't know much about the actual technicalities of how platforms work, how software programs work. And if you watch any of the sort of hearings around whether it's social media or whether it's online harm or anything else that take place in like the American parliaments, we have to have some pretty big questions around whether the people who are coming up with these laws actually understand what it is that they're trying to legislate. I don't think we've seen too many sort of actual presentations from the private sector and from tech companies or from tech players actually representing these sorts of formats in the South African sense. But I think that is something we should definitely look at. I'd say we need to start with educating the legislators if you want to get into the technical side of this. But on the other hand, we need to educate citizens around the potential applications of these laws, which is what we're hopefully doing here today, if that makes sense.
Well, I recall a couple of years ago there was a proposal to put this kind of net nanny around the internet in South Africa. I don't think it went very far, but someone from must have been the Department of Communications did a presentation to the parliamentary committee and said, you know, these porn companies, what they do is they put porn sites right next to educational sites. I just thought this is a guy who probably struggles to actually put his password in. It's just not how it works. Now, the point I wanted to make about Jonathan Haidt, and I think this is where we're going to sort of end the questioning. His book Coddling the American Mind, and I think this feeds very much into his later work on social media, is that we've created this sort of obsessive and this is very much let's say a developed world phenomenon, but South Africa seems to be galloping to catch up with it. We've created a society in which there's an expectation of safety, and someone will protect me and remove the hard edges. And when those hard edges are, when I'm exposed to them, you know, I will respond with maximal disproportionate force. Is that's what he said made social media so dreadful. It was something where you couldn't actually kill someone. It was like a dart gun, but you can inflict a lot of pain. And people sort of really started to enjoy doing that on all sides of the spectrum. You said the big thing there was a like and share button. Beforehand, it was just people putting pictures of their cats and their puppies and whatever, and that was all fun and harmless. When people could start to actually use it to manipulate each other's emotions, it just went out of. On the other hand, you have the Chinese model where you have social credit and you can't buy air tickets or whatever if you
or petrol now.
Or because everything is kind of monitored and so on the one hand a control model that works on what Ezra Levant called the dictatorship of nice. And on the other hand, one that is not a nice dictatorship, but makes damn sure people keep in line. Can we find a way forward that doesn't keep us hostage to either?
Probably, although I do find it greatly ironic that the author of The Coddling of the American Mind is now advocating very strongly for exactly that, coddling and reducing risk and harm through very much the very laws that we're here to talk about today. He's a great advocate now, the same person who was saying we can't base a society based on risk and harm is now one of the primary advocates for age restrictions on social media. Just think that through for a second. In order to implement an age restriction on social media, we have to eradicate anonymity entirely. That means if you are an advocate against an authoritarian government, you're screwed. You can't have an anonymous account. Nope. Because, old Jonathan says, we got to protect the kids. It's always the kids that we use as human shields with these sort of creeping laws, isn't it? Right? So I just find it greatly ironic that the same guy put out both books and has not seen the irony in what he's actually asking for here, right? Like his actual policy recommendations. But that's sort of like my rant to the side. As to whether we can have a society that's based on trust rather than based on rules, which is what we are kind of sleepwalking towards, that's up to us. It's up to the sort of governments that we elect. It's up to the sorts of laws that we challenge. And it's up to the sorts of policies that we support and that we advocate in the sort of organizations, like you mentioned, the IR, who's pushing back against some of these things, right? It's up to us. We get the society that we deserve, much like social media is the social media we deserve, like social media and AI is both like Soylent. It's us, it's people is both of those things. And we've got to be very careful about why we are wanting the sorts of laws that we are wanting and whether we are asking for the impossible, because then we're going to get the impossible, right? And I do like your point around the very great similarities between Canada and China, if you want to look at it, coming to the same point from very different directions, but ending up with the same result, which is really that we don't have a trust-based society anymore. That we're trying to have a rules-based society that reduces risk. And I think that Canada and China, and just much like people everywhere, because people everywhere kind of want the same things, want that reduction in risk without understanding that there is no such thing as a riskless future. We just get to sort of choose which sorts of risks we get. So the risks that we reduce in terms of, protecting our children or protecting our communities greatly increase the risk of government overreach. And which risks are we most comfortable with? It's impossible to promise a future that is riskless, no matter what laws you put in place, much like it's impossible for us to promise a future filled with dignity here in South Africa. Coming back to that, my other favorite sort of skeleton key word, coming from a very different, much more positive space, but it still ends up with the impossibility of government being able to implement the undefinable. And that we are fools if we think that more and greater regulation is going to protect us from ourselves, just like we are fools if we think that putting age restrictions on social media is going to protect our children's minds from being influenced by the ideas of the very society that they live in. They live in it offline too. I don't know if you've noticed, the bad ideas are right out there in the world. They're not only found online.
Bronwyn, as a comment from one of our viewers says, very informative discussion. Thank you, and I can only echo that. And I do look forward to carrying on discussing this with you offline. And we encourage everyone to please like, subscribe, give support to the IRR, irr.org.za, and with that, I think we can draw this to a close, and we do hope that you can take this out. Take this out and discuss this in your social circles and with your work colleagues. With that, goodbye to everyone.